We're so excited today to be back here for our foster and adoption fellowships, give you guys some more content, some more great training. Last time we heard back just so much good feedback from the conversations that were had between families, just learning some things about attachment. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But I've actually got today here with me, this is my buddy Jesse Schroeder. Jesse and I have actually known each other for almost 20 years, and we met in undergrad and went our separate ways. And hilariously enough, have found out that both of us work now in foster care, adoption, trauma-related kids. So I'm gonna let Jesse talk a little bit about what he does and get us going.
Yeah, so I'm a social worker in Columbus, Ohio, and for the last 7 or 8 years, I've worked with children, adolescents, and their families that have pretty significant mental health, behavioral health challenges. And in the last 5 or 6 years, our agency is really focused on understanding kids and families that are dealing with trauma. And our approach to trauma is maybe a little bit different. And so as Blaine and I were talking, and he was saying, I'm helping the families in my church understand the impact of trauma. And I said, hey, that's exactly what I do, but we look at it from the perspective of how the brain works. Yeah. And the more we can understand about the brain, the more we can understand some of the behaviors and some of the responses that we all have when we're experiencing trauma.
Yeah. So we were in a car for a couple hours a couple months ago and just started talking. And really, I was just kind of sharing, here's some things we've been teaching our families here at the church, and was learning so much from Jesse on this issue of emotions and regulation, and just kind of how do we understand ourselves. And really, it's connected to the last video we did on attachment. The two really coincide really well. So if you remember last time, we talked a little bit about attachment. Attachment, again, is an enduring bond that develops over lifetime, and it's based in experience. So it's a learned behavioral response to an experience that a child has. So if you remember the attachment cycle, we talked about it last time, that a child feels this need. They're hungry, they're wet, they're fearful and afraid. They have this need, and the hormones start to increase in their body to where they get hyper aroused and they express this need. Most often for a little infant, this is going to be crying, just expressing this need, because if they don't, right, they might die. If they're hungry and afraid, that's really the reality. And so those hormones just increase until a parent comes, a caregiver comes and responds, and then their body starts to relax and the inhibitory hormones kick back in and everything calms back down. And so this is the cycle that a kid learns early on in life, time and time again. But what we know about families that we're a part of that experience trauma is that cycle hasn't always been well established. That for a lot of the kids in our homes, that experience of having a need and expressing a need, that no one came and no one responded, and they stayed hungry and they stayed afraid. And because of that, they live in that moment of hyperarousal, of just being so afraid and so fearful and so on edge that they're kind of pent up. That emotions in a lot of ways is just kind of pent up in their bodies. And that's the place that those kids come to us. And we're trying to help them calm and experience life and deal with the things that they're going through, but they're stuck a lot of times in this cycle. And really, it's a very physical thing for these kids. So, Jesse, will you talk a little bit just about that physicality of this experience?
It was really neat when we were talking, Blaine, and you were explaining that attachment cycle and your concept of sort of how when the child is in distress and the parent comes and soothes and helps that child. In our work and in the research I've been doing, we call that regulation. And this concept of regulation is so important. And I remember when you and I were talking, it kind of opened up so many conversations. So one of the first key things about regulation to know is that it really is a physical experience. Our brains are designed by God to respond to the physical world around us. So that child in the womb hears the heartbeat of the mother. And when that child is born and is just a new baby infant and is upset and is crying, and the mother comes and picks up the baby and she rocks it and soothes it and shushes and says, shh, and it replicates and recreates that feeling of being in the womb. And that regulates the baby. And that regulating experience is really what we're trying to continue moving forward throughout life. And so even as a young baby is feeling regulated with the rocking and the patting and the shushing, all the way forward as an adult, if I'm getting upset, I'm probably going to go for a walk. If I'm really having a rough day, I might turn on some music that's going to help me calm down. If I'm really in the moment, if I can think a little bit before I react, hopefully I'm going to take a few deep breaths. And that rhythm and that physical experience of going for a walk, listening to some music, taking some deep breaths is going to regulate me. So the attachment cycle is so crucial. And the more we can understand that it is the physical experience that happens between the caregiver and the child, that physical experience is what regulates the child and what regulates us.
Yeah. And it's so natural and normal. I mean, I was talking to Jesse about it, that honestly, it's the thing that I've heard described as, it's the thing that every grandma knows to do when a baby's crying, is to rock them and shush them and do these things. And no one ever told her that, hey, you're giving all this sensory input that's so good for this baby in that moment. But that's kind of what we're doing, what we've been trained and taught to do naturally. But for a lot of us, it's also a thing that we naturally do. So just as a first talking point in your groups and around your tables, it would be really helpful just to think for a little bit about, what do you do, or what do you do with your kids when things get out of control and dysregulated? What are some things that you've noticed, man, life is just different when I stop and do this, or when my kids do this, or when I'm feeling this kind of emotional intensity, and whether it is going for a walk or music or some of those things. What are some things that you do or you do with your kids to help them start to regulate? So hopefully you guys shared some great ideas about just some ways that you found that you regulate yourself, that you regulate your kids. I'm sure some of the stories that you were talking around the table of, I remember when we did this and the day was so different, and our kids responded so differently, and it was because they got a lot of sleep, or because we got a lot of physical activity out, and all of a sudden bedtime was so different, or mealtime was so different because of the way the day went. And that physicality is very important. What we often forget, especially as parents, is that when things are breaking down, when kind of our kids' behaviors are challenging or a little out of control, that we're trying to reason with them. We're trying to use logic. We're trying to use these, what we'll talk about in a minute, these upper brain things that they're not ready for because they're dysregulated. So Jesse, will you share just a little bit, kind of how does that brain chemistry balance work, and what does it look like for our bodies?
Yeah, it's been so amazing in the last several years as I've researched and understand the brain more, and how our brain has this sort of a little bit of a division between what we sometimes call the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain. And you may have heard this before. It's a pretty popular way to understand how we think and process information now. So the downstairs part of our brain, or that lower part of our brain, is some of that automatic response, controls our heart rate, controls our breathing, controls our body temperature, things that we don't even have to think about, but that are just happening all of the time. But as we get into the upstairs part of our brain, that's where more of that logic, more of that consequences, expectations, and some of that abstract and concrete reasoning is happening. And unfortunately, the mistake that we make as parents, the mistake that I make when I'm working with training adults or as a counselor, is when I'm feeling dysregulated, or I can tell that the other individual that I'm with is dysregulated, I try to go upstairs brain first, and I try to reason. And I might say some silly things like, you should think about what you're doing, or what would that look like if you acted that way in a job someday? And the truth is, that just doesn't happen really well. This happened to me the other day. I had a really rough day at work. I was presenting to a large group of people, and I just didn't feel like it went really well. I got a lot of difficult questions. I didn't handle it very well. And as I was driving home, I called my wife, and I said, honey, I'm so mad at myself. I can't believe I acted this way. I can't believe I wasn't better prepared. I'm not good at my job. And clearly, I was really dysregulated. And my wife, I love her, but she came back at me with some upstairs brain thinking. She said, well, maybe next time you should think about preparing better, and you should have your notes written out.
That went over really well, didn't it?
Yeah, I said, thank you very much. I'm going through a spotty patch. I think I might lose you. And I hung up on her because I just wasn't ready to hear it. I was dysregulated at a core level, and I didn't want to hear her reasoning with me at an upper brain level. I just needed her to say, I hear what you're saying. come on home. I fixed some dinner for you. You can eat, you can relax for a bit. We could talk about it later. And a mistake that we all make as parents, that I know when I'm working with teachers and other parents working with kids, is we try to go upstairs brain first. We try to reason first. And when people try to reason with me when I'm dysregulated, it doesn't go very well. I'm not ready to hear it. And so another key idea around regulation is we've got to be regulated first before we can reason. That downstairs brain has to be in place and functioning healthily before we can reason in the moment. And that's part of that teaching and training and helping kids get regulated so that we can reason with them.
Yeah. Yeah, when I've heard this training before, this downstairs, upstairs brain, one of the comparisons that another guy that I listen to a lot talks about is that the stairs between the downstairs and the upstairs are just cluttered with junk. For kids with an experience of trauma, there's shoes and books and all kinds of stuff, and our kids just can't get up the stairs as fast as we would love for them to be able to do. So it's even being more understanding. They just need more time sometimes to have that regulation experience to get there before they can get up to some of that reasoning. And then oftentimes as parents, I mean, we do this, right? The kid that falls and you've told them 100 times not to run in the house, not to run into the house, not to run in the house, and they fall and you go, well, what did you think was going to happen? Right? That's right. The actual thing we want to do is pick them up and comfort them and talk them through. So can we understand like why we've said not running in the house and what to do differently? And now they're at a teachable moment because they are calm and regulated and those kind of things.
Got to have that physical regulating response first before going reason, logic, talking, thinking.
Yeah.
Regulate first and then reason with them.
Yeah. So let's talk again at your tables in your group for a little bit about some times when you felt really dysregulated and someone tried to come at you in that upstairs brain rational reasoning place and you were not ready for it, or maybe some ways that you feel like, as a parent, oh gosh, just this last week this happened and I was really trying to reason with a kid that wasn't ready for that, and now I'm seeing, man, I should have taken a different tact in that scenario. So talk together for a little bit about that topic. All right, so we're talking about this issue of regulation. And again, we started off with this idea of attachment is the kind of early piece where regulation starts, and regulation is a very physical thing that is about even just as infants, building this bond, building this relationship between this physicality of getting relaxed and calm, that when we are anxious and all these things going on, we need that physical activity to make that happen. And then we just shared a little bit about how that kind of relates to our ability to ration and reason, that a lot of times this is the problem, is that we're dysregulated, and that's a very physical thing that we need to work through and get through, but we're trying to live in this upstairs brain and regulate through reason and ration, which is just not going to happen for us. But I think the other kind of key part to think about here is just how do we help our kids regulate best? And sometimes that responsibility kind of falls on us as parents.
Yeah, I love that question, Blaine. How can we help our kids the best? Because ultimately that's why we're here, right? That's why we're in this field. That's why we've chosen to accept this call, is we care about the children and the kids that God has given to us. So how really can we help them? And in my training, in the work that I do, we have this phrase that we say all the time, that the best thing for a dysregulated child is a regulated adult. And again, if you think back to that young infant who is crying, who is just wailing because, oh, what has happened? I have a wet diaper. The world is ending for that poor little child. What that child needs is a regulated adult, a loving, caring mother who can come in and pick up that little baby and soothe and rock and help that baby regulate. But reality, and this is reality in my home, I've got 2 young girls, and this is reality when I'm working in schools or working with families. The best thing for a dysregulated child is a regulated adult, but the truth is sometimes I'm not that regulated adult.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to know the signs for myself when I am getting dysregulated. And believe me, I've had moments, I'm not a perfect parent, and none of us are. I've had moments where my daughter is getting upset, and I'm getting upset with her, and I'm looking at her, and I'm saying, you need to do what I'm telling you. And my wife says, hey, honey, I think you're getting a little bit upset. And I say, no, I got this. I probably should pull back and realize.
That's never happened in my home. So
Well, okay, that's why we can learn from you, Blaine. And I need to realize in those moments, I'm dysregulated.
Yeah.
I need to take a moment to get that lower brain in a better space so that then I can access that upstairs brain. So I've had to learn what are the signs for myself when I feel my fists clenching, when I feel my teeth clenching together, when I notice that my voice is raising. I got to give myself a timeout. I've got to say to my children and to my family, I need to step away and regulate and to model that behavior. And that happens to all of us. And part of the key, one of the first steps of really learning to be an effective parent is knowing those signs of my own dysregulation and developing some tools to help myself regulate.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, a lot of the research tells us that only 7% of the things we communicate are actually words. Most of it is body language and tone. So most of that experience of dysregulation for me especially is just knowing that like I'm sensing my tone getting intense, that my body language is overly aggressive, that like I know that I am just not in control of the situation right now. And that lack of control then is even more dysregulating for the child I'm trying to interact with and help. And so for a few more minutes before we wrap up, we're going to have our leaders come back and kind of wrap you guys up, talk all together, and pray together. We think is really important. All the stuff we've unpacked today, we want you guys to stop and just pray about some of those experiences and some of those ways you can move forward as parents. But if you'll talk together with your group or around your table for a little bit longer, just about what do you notice when you're thinking about how do I notice that I'm getting dysregulated as a parent? And what am I going to do? What are some simple steps I can think about moving forward that I'm going to do to stop and to try and regulate before I engage again? What are some ways that I'm going to, grab a friend who's going to keep me accountable to that? What are some ways I'm going to talk with my spouse about that a little bit? What are some practical steps that you can take to kind of develop that skill as a parent? So talk about that for a little while. Then our leaders are going to come back and close us before we finish up today. Well, I hope that you enjoyed getting something out of the content that Jesse and I gave today just on this issue of regulation. We both think it's just super important for you guys as parents. It's such a great skill that you can work on. So Jesse's actually agreed. He's going to come back Saturday, October 26th from 8:30 to 11:30 a.m. It's going to be here at the Blankenbaker campus doing a 3-hour training on this topic and really unpacking a lot more. And so what's that going to entail a little bit?
Yeah, I'm really excited for this. This is a training that I do with parents, teachers, and service providers all over the Franklin County area in Columbus, Ohio. And we really focus on understanding how our brain works, understanding and unpacking a little bit more of that downstairs, upstairs brain dynamic, and then really digging into this concept of self-regulation and co-regulation. How do we regulate each other? How do we regulate the children and the kids that we're working with? And we really try to dig into some practical tools, some specific strategies that you can use, that you can bring into your home to really help yourself and to help the kids that are living with you to be more regulated, to build that bond, and really to increase that attachment that you've been talking about so much.
Yeah. So that training is already up on the southeastchristian.org website. You can go there right now and register. We do have some limited childcare available for that Saturday morning. We really hope that you'll come, join us, really get some great skills for you as a parent. So we hope to see you there October 26th. Thanks.